So if you're ready, say I'm ready. I believe you. Okay, we're jumping in to week 3 of a series called Sent. And what we've been doing is we have been navigating through what it means to actually be sent by God to something. If you were with us in January, we did a series that we called Called, right? And in the Called series, we talked about what's called formational calling. And what formational calling is the thing that every single believer is called to. Every single person who breathes, whether you know Jesus or not in this room, there is a calling on your life called a formational calling. And here's what that calling is. It's a calling directly from Jesus that says, I want you to accept salvation. I want you to choose me. I want you to give your life to me and be saved. Not only do I want you to be saved, but after you're saved, not before, but after you're saved, I want us to work through a process called sanctification. And what sanctification really means is to become more holy or more like Jesus. And it's not a process that once we get saved, we make a list of all the things that we need to change. What happens is as we submit our life to Jesus, He changes these things in us. It starts with yes to Jesus and then moves to Jesus changing things in us because we submit to Him. Saved, then sanctified. And finally, we're called to be sent. That there is a calling on our life, on every single person's life, once they say yes to Jesus and start moving towards Him, that He wants to send you. To what, Pastor Tim? I don't know. Because I can't tell you. Because everyone's call is different. But He wants to send you. So what we're doing in the month of February is wrestling through what it means to be sent. And we make this statement every single week. That every follower of Jesus has a missional calling that is prepared for them by God. God actually, in advance, prepared good works for you to do, as it talks about in the book of Ephesians. He prepared in advance good works for you to do, and He's calling you and beckoning you and sending you to do those good works. And what we're doing all month is wrestling through what that looks like. And on the end of this, what I can tell you is we're not going to leave you hanging. On the end of this, we're going to find a way. And I'm not ready to tell you all the details of it yet, but we have a way that we're going to wrestle through what are you individually actually called to. And we're going to do that together, okay? Everyone has a missional calling on their life prepared in advance for them to do by God, and that's the wrestling match that we are in right now. And so, we've been doing that by looking at Moses. We've been hanging out with Moses all month so far in the book of Exodus. And the reason we've been hanging out with Moses is because Moses is sent. And some of the emotions Moses goes through should feel familiar to us. You know, here's this guy who's living a fairly normal life at this point. He was born Hebrew in Egypt. Hebrew baby boys were all being killed by the Pharaoh. He was sent in a little tiny, the Hebrew word is ark. He was sent in a little ark down the river, raised by Egyptians, raised to be Egyptian, found himself out one day seeing an Egyptian beat a Hebrew slave, lost his mind, killed that dude, and buried him in the sand. And guess what? People found out about it. So let me help you. If you murder someone, people are going to find out. I encourage you not to do that. Okay? People find out when there's a murder. People found out, the Pharaoh decided that it was time to kill Moses. Moses took off into the wilderness, into a place called Midian, where he found a wife named Zipporah. And they raised children together. And he raised sheep for 40 years. Moses had a wife and kids and raised sheep. Life was normal, predictable, in rhythm. Doesn't that sound nice? Predictable, normal, in rhythm life. Like where everything is just kind of, I know what to expect. I got to get the same amount of sheep back as I took out. And I got to make sure my wife's happy. Happy wife, happy life, right? And so Moses is just kind of living that until he sees a bush on fire on the side of Mount Sinai. And he begins to inspect it and realizes that the bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. Something spiritual might be happening here. Then God speaks to Moses and says, I got a plan for you. And Moses begins to, and the plan is, Moses, I want you to go back to the place where things were crazy and let my people free. Help them to come free. And Moses is like, okay, so I hear you, but there's all these reasons why I'm not your guy. Like, how's this going to work? Well, how do I explain who you are? What do I call you? What do they call you? How does all this figure itself out? And like, do you know I'm just like an old shepherd? Like, I even have like some kind of like speech problem. I'm not sure I'm your guy. He's got all these reasons why he's not the one. And I'm telling you, when the Lord sends you to something, you're going to have 1,000 reasons why you're not the one. Why you're not the one who should go. And so we ended last week by saying this. God says to Moses, what's that in your hand? And Moses says, it's my shepherd's staff. And God says, throw it on the ground. And when he throws it on the ground, it turns into a snake, right? It begins to slither. Moses freaks out like any of us would, but eventually God says, pick it back up. And when Moses picks it back up, it turns back into a staff. And one of the things we ended last week was this. If we put what we have in God's hands, we'll always have more than we realize. See, in the hands of Moses, it's a staff. When Moses lets go of it, and now it's God's, it turns into something completely different. Whatever you have in your hands, whatever skills you possess, whatever things God could use, if you'll release them to him, they become something different. Because God gives life to things that are not life in our hands. Whatever you have in God's hands can be more than you realize. We also said this: God sends people who feel like they don't have what it takes every time. It's what God does. God continues to send people who go, I'm not sure I'm the right one. And then once they realize it's God, some people jump right in. Other people say, I have 5 more reasons why I'm still not the right one, right? There's a wrestling match that happens. But God sends people who don't think they have what it takes. And the truth is, just a news flash, none of us have what it takes without the Lord. We're just not that good. None of us. We're not that talented. We're not that smart. We're not that good without the Lord going with us. And the third piece is this. We said this last week. Because God is our partner, we don't have to have it all figured out. See, we get to a spot where we're like, well, if God sends me to this, and that means this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. And I'm not sure I'm ready for what's going to happen in 5 years if I do this one thing right now. And we get way ahead of ourselves. Sometimes God just sends us to something, and it's not going to work out the way you think it is. Sometimes God sends us to something, and it turns, and we didn't see the turn. We don't have to have it all figured out because we're not going alone. The Lord goes with us. Okay? So that takes us to Exodus chapter 5. At the end of Exodus chapter 4, Moses finally says he'll go because God's going to let Aaron go with him, his brother. They head back to Egypt. They do what God told them to do, which is to tell the people, the Lord is going to free you. He's heard your prayer. We're going to go speak to the Pharaoh. And all of them worshiped the Lord. All the Hebrew people worshiped the Lord because he showed up to rescue them. Now it's chapter 5, verse 1, and it says this. Afterward, which is after the time of worship, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, let my people go, which is the Hebrew word for send. Send my people away, right? Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. And then Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Like, who's this weird God you're talking about, right? What makes your God worth listening to? If you don't know this, if you're not familiar with Egyptian culture, at this point, there are about 1,500 gods in Egypt known by name. The god of sand, the god of sun, the god of rain, right? The god of fertility, the god of love. There's just 1,500 gods known by name. And now these two dudes, who the Pharaoh's not even really familiar with, show up and they're like, can we get a weekend off to go into the wilderness and hold a festival to worship our one God? And Pharaoh's response is, who's your God? And why should I listen? Verse 6, that same day Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. See, this is a big deal, and this is a moment where you should have gasped because there's no straw. So let's do it together. There's no straw. I know. Big deal, right? The reason not having straw is a big deal is because at this point, you have to understand where we are. We're in Egypt. We're in a desert situation. They don't have access to wood, okay? So they're not building things out of wood. They have stone, but stone is not very ready and available. They can't build giant buildings out of stone. Okay, they can build foundations out of stone, but you know what's all over the place in a desert? Dirt and sand, right? So what they found was they can make this mud mixture if they added water to the dirt and sand, that they could make this mud mixture that was similar to clay. But here's the problem. When that mud mixture finally cools into the form of a brick, and it gets really hot in Egypt if you didn't know. It gets really hot, those bricks will just melt. It's just water and like the water will come out of them and they'll just kind of crumble and melt. Like this isn't a good situation. However, if you add straw to the mud mixture, it holds its form better and so the sun won't shrink the bricks. And it becomes a thermal insulator that allows the heat to be dispersed differently, that it keeps these bricks from melting. There has to be straw in these bricks in order to build things that will last. And what he's saying is, this whole time that the Israelites have been making these bricks, they've been stomping in the mud to mix the mud and the dirt together, right? Like if you think about like your KitchenAid mixer at home, and you put like dry ingredients in it, and then you put some wet ingredients in it, and then you just spin it until it makes this new thing, like cookie dough or something. Like it's a new thing from all the dry and wet ingredients. The thing that's spinning the mud are the feet of the Israelites. They're stomping it and they're mixing it and turning it into a completely different mixture. But what's happening is the Egyptians are providing all the straw. See, from the offerings and grain offerings that are all throughout Egypt, they're taking everything that gets on the threshing floor and they're bringing it out to the Israelites to give them straw to make these bricks. And now what they're saying is not go to our reserves and get your own straw. They're saying go out into the fields and find your own straw. There's none there. There's none there. You got to go do it yourself. Maybe he feels like they got a little bit too much time on their hands to be thinking about God, their God or whatever. So verse 8, it says this, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy, and that's why they're crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to the lies. Man, let's make them work twice as hard. Let's send half the people out to find straw. Let's keep the quota the same, and these people will work like dogs. And if I can make them work like dogs, they don't got time to think about anything else but the work, right? What he's saying is they've got too much time to think. They need to listen and do what they're told. They need to listen to the instruction of the Pharaoh and just do what they're told. You know, I've been saying that for 17 years to my children. Listen and do what you're told. You've heard that out of my mouth before, right, Jack? Listen and do what you're told. And they don't, do they? Parents in the room. Not always, right? Listen and do what you're told. That's what Pharaoh is saying to the people. In verse 12, so the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use as straw. Stubble is like what's left after you take out the grain. Like we're talking like little chunky pieces of grain that somehow have to be enough to put straw in the bricks so that the buildings will hold their shape. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day, just as you did when you had straw. And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers that they had appointed, demanded, why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? Isn't this interesting? Think about yourself as an Israelite. Moses and Aaron are here to save the day. We worship the Lord like, yay. And now all of a sudden things are like 1,000 times worse. Like, wait a minute. What's happening here? It's getting more difficult, not easier. So these Israelite overseers who somehow had the favor of Pharaoh to be able to speak to him, they go to Pharaoh in verse 15. Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh. Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told to make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Like the Israelite overseers are going, we don't understand what changed. We don't understand why things are different all of a sudden. This makes no sense to us. Verse 17, Pharaoh said, lazy. That's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told you are not to reduce the number of bricks required for you each day. They went to the Pharaoh directly, and he goes, no, they got it right. You're going to produce the same quota, and guess what? You're going to find your own straw. Why? Because you're lazy, and you talk to me about going and worshiping your God. I'm not budging. Well, in this moment, the Israelite overseers finally realize why they're being punished. Oh, this is the Moses and Aaron thing. This is the Moses and Aaron thing. Because we wanted to go worship the Lord, that's why he's acting this way. What Pharaoh was really saying to them is spending time with your God doesn't matter. I am your God. You will do what I tell you to do. You're not being sent to anywhere because you've already been sent to me because I am the God that you need to pay attention to. Do what you're told. I think there are some people who see the God of Israel that way, the God that we serve through Jesus. Like, I think some people think he's just like, almost like a Pharaoh. Like, just do what you're told. Shut up. Listen. And if you mess up, hell. Like, I think some people think that's who God is, and they've lost sight of the grace and the beauty of God, that it is true that we must follow him. It's true, but we do it because of the grace of God allows us to, because we're not that good. We're not good enough to receive the love and blessing of following God, but he chooses to do it anyway. He chooses to draw us in anyway. He's not a Pharaoh. He's loving, and he's caring. And frankly, if you're in the space today and you don't know Jesus, I guess I just want you to know that God is not out for you. He's not out to harm you or get you. God is trying to save you from the natural consequence of a sinful world called hell. He doesn't send you to hell. This world sends you to hell, and he created a way out in his grace and love for us. Verse 20, when they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said this, check this out. May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. I mean, Moses didn't want to go anyway. He's like, I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to be here. I told the Lord no like 1,000 times. Now I'm here actually doing it, and you want to say, may the Lord judge me? Like, he's got to feel so defeated, because what they're actually saying is you weren't sent here by God and you're ruining everything. We had a good thing going as slaves. Isn't that interesting? We had a good thing going here. I mean, they gave us straw. We're in a good spot. Now you show up and you ruin everything? Imagine being Moses. You already felt like you couldn't pull it off. You already felt like you weren't enough. You already felt like this was a terrible idea. And now the people who were like way excited because God was going to release them and we're worshiping the Lord and thank you for being, and there's this big high. Now there's this giant low. Man, you've ruined everything. Why are you even here? May the Lord judge you. See, being sent isn't always easy, is it? Being sent doesn't mean everything's going to work out in your favor. And sometimes being sent reminds us of all the things that we can't pull off, that we're not enough. Church family, I want you to know that if you really commit to being sent, if we become a congregation that doesn't just show up to church on Sundays, but missionally is trying to figure out what God is calling us into this community. If you're actually going to be sent, there will be moments where you feel inadequate. There will be moments where you hit a wall. There will be moments where you think you've done everything the Lord asked of you, and it's not easy. You wish things looked different. You hoped they would look different because we have this mindset, whether we realize it or not, that if God sends us to something, it's going to work out. Like, God only deals in happy endings, right? So, like, if God sends us, well, everything's going to be perfect then. If God sends me to go pray with a stranger, and I walk up and I say, "Can I pray with you?" Every single one of them is going to accept Jesus. And every single one of them is going to find a way to tell me their life story. And every single one of them is going to cry. And every single one of them is going to be like, "You've changed my life." Those things happen. But some people just say, "No, thank you." And if you get somebody who's really hurting, they've got other words for you than "no, thank you." See, we think if God sends us, it's about the happy ending. But sometimes God sends us to things that are really hard and don't work out the way we think they should. If I told you that every person you approached and tried to talk to about Jesus would spit in your face, every single one. But the next person who told them about Jesus after you would lead them to the Lord every single time. Is it in God's will? Is it God sending you to be spat in the face? Yes. Well, that's not what I want. I want the Lord sent me, I walked in and everything just turned to roses. Everything like worked out. I want to do what God tells me to do and everything works out perfectly. And that's not how God works. But it's how we want him to work. It's how we think he should work. It's how Moses expected him to work. I can see Moses just with his head in the sky going, "See, I told you. I'm not your guy. You picked the wrong person." We do have some of Moses' words to the Lord. In Exodus 5, verses 22 and 23, it says this: "Moses returned to the Lord and said, 'Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people. You have not rescued your people at all.'" Moses is like, "Dude, you told me I'm coming here to rescue them and we're going to come back to the mountain. And when we get back to the mountain, we're going to worship you and everything's going to be great and we're going to be your people, right? But ever since I showed up, ever since I got here, there's nothing but trouble. Do you even care? Do you see me? Do you see the people of Israel? Did you send me for a reason you didn't tell me about? Because you've done nothing." Man, it breaks my heart, but I get it. I get why Moses is responding this way, because he's human. And he's on this mountaintop. Think back. He's on this mountaintop with a burning bush, and he's like, "Who am I that you would send me?" And God responded to him on the mountain and said, "I will go with you." Right? I will go with you. And in this moment, Moses has lost the voice of God, right? It's not even a whisper. I mean, it's not, maybe on the burning bush, it was, "I will go with you." And maybe in some rough times on the way, it was more like, "I will go with you." But it was always there. The voice of God was always there. But in this moment, he's like, "Where are you?" What little faith. I mean, could you imagine living a life where when things are good, you worship the Lord, but when things are bad, you act like he's not there at all? I mean, we would never do that, would we? Like, we would never just praise the Lord when things are good, and then when things are not good, say, "Do you even see me? Do you even know me? Are you even here?" It's what we do all the time. We're guilty. We're just as guilty as Moses of forgetting the whisper of "I will go with you." Some things I want you to hear today as we begin to wrap up. Some things I want you to hear today is this. First, I want you to know that when God sends us, the path is not always easy. When God sends us, if you really want to be on missional calling with God, and you're committing that, hey, I know I've been doing this church thing for a long time, but I now realize there's something more here. Like, and I want to do the more. And I want to say yes before I even know what it is. If that's true of you, you need to hear this. You need to hear that when God sends us, the path is not easy. There are moments when it's easy. But we have this version of success where we think we know what God wants for us and we don't. It's painful. Following Jesus is painful. It's difficult. I mean, imagine here, let me just be a salesman for a second. I have an offer for you, okay? Here's my offer. I need you to sell your house, quit your job, leave your family. I want to send you to Egypt, okay? But here's what I can promise you. It'll be painful and you'll hate it. Deal? It's a terrible deal. It's a terrible deal. The only thing that makes the deal good, the only thing that makes it even worth doing is the phrase, I will go with you. The fact that it's where Jesus is, that wherever that pain is and that heartache and all that is, that Jesus is there too, is the only thing that makes it worth it when we follow him and when we're sent by him. The only thing that makes it worth it. Why would I give up control of my life to the God of the universe? Like, I love being in control. If you didn't know that about me already, I love control. Why would I give up control? Because God is God. Otherwise, I would never do it. It's not worth it. It's too much pain, right? Part of understanding and following Jesus is understanding that in the good times and in the bad, he goes with you. Amen? My heart breaks today for a family in our church. Many of you, or some of you may know Crystal and Thomas Steiger. And not to draw a ton of attention to them, but they're in the front row over here. Right over there. If you don't know who Thomas is, he's a giant man with red hair and covered in tattoos. So you're like, oh, that guy. I know that guy. I just didn't know his name was Thomas, right? Thomas and I have become very good friends, but they're in a season right now that is actually extremely difficult. Let's go back 2 weeks. Crystal's father was put on hospice 2 weeks ago with some significant health concerns, and his time on this earth was already known to be very short. And last Sunday, in between services, I received a message from Crystal that he had passed away. And so Crystal's father, or Thomas's father-in-law, passed away last Sunday. And I was honored to do the funeral on Friday. At the same time that this is happening, Thomas's dad is very sick. And I did the funeral for Crystal's dad on Friday. And on Saturday, I got a call from Thomas that his dad had passed away. And so the Steiger family has lost both their father and their father-in-law in a week. In 1 week. Crystal's dad, Mike, passed away on Sunday. Thomas's dad, Jack, passed away on Saturday. In 1 week, they've lost both. And let me tell you, and I know he won't hate me for this, because he could actually hurt me. 5 years ago, if this would have happened, Thomas Steiger would not be okay. He would be making decisions that would be harmful for his family and harmful to himself. Am I right? But he found Jesus. And he fell in love with Jesus, right? And Pastor Allen had the opportunity to baptize Thomas before he left. And Thomas has been wrestling and walking through with Jesus for a while now, and so has Crystal. And at the funeral for Crystal's dad on Friday, I was talking to Thomas. And Thomas said this to me. My dad's going to pass away very shortly. But here's what I know. God is with me. And I don't have to make poor decisions because I can get through this because Jesus is by my side. And yeah, it's beautiful, right? Yeah, it's great. Here's the thing, man, and I'm not doing that just to like pat Thomas on the back or Crystal on the back or anything like that. Here's the secret sauce of following Jesus. There's no guarantee the good and the bad, because let me just tell you, everything human turns out bad. This human race, this human world is just bad. And everything good that we find here is because of Jesus. And when we say, you know what, in the midst of the bad, I'm just going to cling to Jesus, I'm going to get to the other side of it. It doesn't make it less painful. It doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make it like, well, you know what? My dad died. It's fine. He's in a better place. Like, it's not that. It's hurtful and hard, but there's something about the God of the universe by our side that gets us to the other end of it, and when we get there, we love him more, not less. Amen? And so it's interesting to watch and journey with Thomas. Thomas and I actually meet pretty much weekly. We go out to dinner together, and it's interesting to journey with him and see how the Lord is changing him. And let me tell you something else. Yeah, I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm going to talk about your business. You can hit me later. There was a point about a year ago where Thomas looked at me and he said, I don't know if my dad knows Jesus. And it's kind of making me uncomfortable. And what if he dies? He's getting sicker and sicker. And I don't know if he knows Jesus. Would you talk to him? And I was like, sure. So the next time Thomas and I met for dinner, he brought Jack with him. And the three of us sat at a table. Now, I don't know if Jack's fully in love with Jesus because he's a Yankees fan. That's a whole other issue. But Jack and I sat across from each other, and I looked at him and I said, do you know why you're here? He said, to have dinner with you. He's got this thick New York accent, right? He's like, to have dinner with you. And I'm like, okay, that's not why you're here. Your son doesn't know if you know Jesus. And look at me. I mean, we're right across the table from each other. Look at me. Do you know Jesus? And he kind of crossed his arms, and he looked at me, and he said a couple things. The first thing he said was when he was younger, he went to church regularly and fell in love with Jesus at a young age, but walked away. Like, just walked away from all that. And then he said this: I have fallen back in love with Jesus because I've watched my son's life completely change. So he said, so yeah, I love Jesus. And I said, okay, you know what that means. Like, you know he died for you on the cross, he loves you, he rose from the grave. Like, and he's like, yeah. I'm like, okay. And then I looked at Thomas, and Thomas went, okay. And then Jack ordered some potato skins, and we had dinner. Remember that? And so there's this comfort in his passing because, frankly, Jack knew Jesus, whether it was pretty or messy or whatever that was, he knew Jesus. But you know why he knew Jesus? Because Thomas fell in love with Jesus. And now, as Jack passes, Thomas can lean on the same Jesus in the midst of his pain, right? Because there's no promise that there's not pain. So if there's not pain in the following of Jesus, why would there also, if there is pain in the following of Jesus, why wouldn't there also be pain in the sending of Jesus? That when he sends us to something, it's painful. There are moments where it's difficult. There's tension. It's hard. Sometimes all we have is to cry out to him and say, are you sure I'm where I'm supposed to be? But on the other side of that, God's response is, I sent you. I sent you. I've talked to businessmen in this church who felt they were called to a new position in their business, or they were called to leave their company and go to a different company. And they get there and they hate it. And they said to me, I must have misunderstood Jesus, because he would never send me to something that I hate. Actually, he would. And I'm not saying because he's like sadistic. It's not because Jesus hates you. It's because his mindset is much larger than just whether or not we're happy. Sometimes we're called to something that's hard and difficult. Sometimes when we're called, not everyone will be happy that you were sent there, right? Not everyone's you may show up someplace and they're like, nope, get out. Get out. We don't want you here. It's exactly where you're sent, but it's difficult. It's difficult. But here's what I know. And this is what we can lean on. If God sent you, he's not done. If God sends you to something, He's not done. And if it's difficult, but he's there with you. If it's painful, but he's there with you. And his plan is perfect. His plan is perfect. If God is with you and he sent you, he is not done. There's a verse that says he works for the good of those who love him. He's working for your good in Romans 8:28. He's working for your good because he loves you. Because he loves you. Well, if you're with us every week, you know that something we do is we call them car conversations. It's a couple questions that you can ask in your car on the way home with your child, or you could even ask each other as you leave this place just to keep the conversation of the message going. Here are the two car conversations for today. The first is this. Have you ever felt like you tried to listen to God and it didn't make a difference at all? Have you ever felt like you did exactly what God said and you're like, well, this is terrible. Like, this doesn't make a difference at all. Talk about that situation. And the second is this. How would you have responded if you were an Israelite? Like they show up, we're going to set you free. The Lord is so good. Now go get your own straw. Keep the same quota. How would you have responded? Because my guess is if we stop and think about it, we would have responded a lot of the same way that they responded, which is, what have you done to us? What have you done to us? The bottom line this morning is this. Every follower of Jesus has a missional calling that is prepared for them by God. His plan is perfect even when it's painful. Hear me out. His plan is perfect even when it's painful. Why? Because he's with us and he journeys together. I find myself at times wanting to just scream out to God when things don't work the way I want them to. When things don't turn out the way I expect, it's like, come on, dude, I did exactly what you told me to do. Like, what are we doing here? But every time I wrestle and argue with God, I end up at the exact same spot. The exact same spot where I finally just put my hands down and I say this: you are God, I am not. You are God, I am not, and I trust you. So, he is God. You are not. He either gets all of your life and you give it to him, or you keep control because you want your life as a shepherd living in a field for 40 years with your wife and your kids, and you don't want to disrupt the rhythm. You don't want to give it all up to him and let him do what he wants with your life because that'll be messy. Yeah, it's messy. But I have spent the last 17 years of my life the last 17 years of my life trying to hunt and find and search for the call that God has on my life. Not to be a pastor, like I'm not that. But like, Lord, I want to be exactly where you want me, exactly in your will. I have been wrestling and fighting for that for 17 years. Some of you have been doing that much longer than me. But finally, 17 years ago, I just submitted all of myself to him. My answer is yes to whatever you have for me for the rest of my life. I've been wrestling through that. And it has been painful and uncomfortable. There have been seasons where I've thought, what are we doing? There have been seasons where I'm not happy. There are seasons where I take something too far. There have been seasons where I'm not a great dad. There have been seasons where I'm not a great husband. There have been seasons where I'm not a great disciple. And I just keep clawing and wrestling and moving towards Jesus. And in the process of that, what I can tell you is following Jesus has been the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life. Going to church has always been easy. Going to church is easy. Following Jesus is the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life. And it has brought pain and discomfort. It has brought tension in my spirit. It has brought so much joy and peace. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. There is nothing this world could offer that's pain-free that I would take over the wrestling match with Jesus until the day I die. So he is God, and I am not. And he gets all of me, the good and the bad. And I surrender my life to him. And so church family, that's my ask of you. If you want to be missional, if you want to be sent, if you want to hear God's voice and know what he's calling you to, you have to surrender everything. And you have to decide that the most painful days of your life with God are better than the easiest days without him.